Hey, buddy. Welcome to Hayek's Health Club. As you probably know, we're the only chain of gyms totally devoted to the theories of Austrian economist F.A. Hayek.
I guess I had heard that.
My name is Wolf. I'll be your personal trainer. I'm a fully certified Libertarian health and fitness instructor.
Who does that certification?
Nobody. That would be an intrusion by a smothering outside authority. You don't want that, do you, buddy?
I guess not. So, what kind of program will you be setting up for me?
None at all. Here at Hayek's, we're very hands-off. We are committed to giving you none-on-one attention.
You mean one-on-one?
No, none-on-one. We believe in individualism. We know you'll reach your potential if we don't interfere with you.
I was just thinking in terms of, should I do more weights, or...
We're not falling into that interventionalist trap. As your personal trainer, my job is to set you free so you can experience that natural market ecosystem that'll regulate your workouts.
I'm just wondering how many clients you could possibly have.
Oh, we don't have any. You would be the first, but that's okay. What are we supposed to do? Move into a government-sponsored enterprise zone? Apply for tax credits?
I see your point.
Now, there's a radio show about to start. Whether you people listen to it is entirely your business. You will make the best choice, whatever choice you make, okay? And now he demands that we withdraw from the International House of Pancakes, Colin McEnroe.
That is true. As a libertarian, I don't believe we should participate in the International House of Pancakes. Before you know it, we'll be involved with Belgian waffles, and it's a slippery slope. All right. So at the beginning of the show today, we are going to talk about a party that maybe you don't pay that much attention to in most election cycles, but which may have a kind of rising significance right now for lots of reasons that are probably self-evident. But like most self-evident things, this being public radio, we'll probably explain them to you anyway. And then towards the end of the show, we're going to talk about two very different men who left very different marks. Each one has died recently. One of them is Muhammad Ali, and the other is David Chase. David Chase, who survived 3 different concentration camps, and before becoming one of the richest men in America at one point, and certainly one of Hartford's and Connecticut's great benefactors, one of the people who helped found the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and many other things as well. So, 2 stories to tell you about that. But we're going to tell you some libertarian stories first, and to help us do that, Jennifer Rubin is joining us. She's the author of the Right Turn blog for the Washington Post, and Claire Malone is senior political writer for 538, where she's also I've become a fan of her appearances on their podcast, where she plays, what does she play? She plays the popular girl who makes fun of the nerds exactly the way the nerds like to be made fun of. I think I have summed that up. All right, so, and Claire, since that's who you are, I'm going to get started with you, just in terms of the numbers. And I know you're not one of those quants, but you sitteth on the right hand of those quants. So how significant are Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, the ticket for the Libertarian Party, according to the numbers so far? And I guess we should also bracket that by saying they don't always appear in polls in order to become significant.
They don't appear in polls very often at all. The Johnson himself has been in 3 national polls so far, and I think as people know who are paying attention to the race, even casually, there are tons and tons of polls. So 3 is not too many to be included in, but he's been polling at about 10 or 11% in these couple of surveys that have come out, which is a decent showing. Now, of course, the threshold in order to get into the presidential debates is 15%, so he still has a little bit of ways to go, but I think it's still a pretty significant number, and given the fact that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are sort of historically they have historically high unfavorable ratings, it could get interesting with Gary Johnson and Bill Weld.
Yeah, so Jennifer Rubin, many of my Republican friends have talked to me about third parties. Is there going to be another kind of candidacy that they can support if they can't quite hold their nose and deal with Trump? Well, there kind of already is one. I guess the question would be, Jennifer, whether or not it conforms to the kinds of needs that a dissatisfied with Trump Republican would have.
It depends what kind of conservative you're talking about. If you're talking about a conservative who believes one of President Obama's weakest points has been an insufficiently robust national security, you're probably not going to like Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. if you are a social conservative and think the bane of the United States is now gay marriage and want to reverse it and want to see if you can roll back Roe v. Wade, you're not going to like these guys either because they are socially what we call liberal, but they would say libertarian. I think the type of conservatives who would be attracted to them are people who really do not have a home in this election cycle, and that is people who favor less government regulation, less taxes, a reduced footprint in the economy. Those are the people that Gary Johnson and Bill Weld may resonate with. They are both experienced governors. Ironically, they may be the most experienced people in the contest overall. They have about 14 years of governing experience. Bill Weld, of course, in Massachusetts, and Gary Johnson in New Mexico, both infamously stingy on budgets, both tax cutters. Gary Johnson has said anything that shrinks the federal government, he would be in favor of. So I think it's those types of Republicans, and I think the other type of voter who's going to be there is just someone who's looking for a protest vote. They may not subscribe to everything that Gary Johnson and Bill Weld have to say, but they can't bring themselves to vote for either one of the major candidates. And that, too, may be a source of votes for them.
So, Claire, one thing that we want to know, but because of that dearth of polling that you described before, we may not know. We probably want to know a little bit more about the demographics of potential libertarian support, right? We have some ideas, some of which are misconceptions about who actually supports Donald Trump, who actually supports Hillary Clinton, in terms of, what kind of person, what age bracket, what race, what income, what education. I guess what we probably don't know, unless we intuit it from their positions, is what kind of person demographically might gravitate towards a libertarian slate.
Sure. Yeah, and I think Jennifer touched on something, which is, libertarians will tell you that they are very distinct. I think there's a little bit of an idea right now that they're sort of Republican light, and they do obviously have a lot in common with sort of the fiscal conservatism, but there is a whole, drug legalization culture side to things. So it's a very interesting mix. I think we can look at people who might be lodging, pulling the libertarian lever as perhaps being, maybe people who were Kasich voters. I think that Republicans in urban areas around the country could be ripe. We can look a little bit and see that in the Virginia governor's race in 2013, a man named Robert Sarvis ran as a libertarian there and got almost 7% of the vote. And actually, this might be surprising to some listeners, but I don't think it's just going to be protest vote Republicans who might be going over for Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. In the Sarvis race, a breakdown of exit polls and sort of precincts found that a lot of areas that had gone, pretty highly for Terry McAuliffe, Sarvis did incredibly well as well. And, I think if you look at a couple of these national polls that have been out about, Weld and Johnson, I guess just Johnson, in head-to-head versus the three-way race, Johnson was actually pulling a little bit of more support from Hillary Clinton. So I think the idea that the legalization of marijuana, of drugs in general, is a pretty big marquee issue for libertarians, and I think that's a little bit more likely to play well with, say, a disaffected Sanders Democrat who might be looking to say, hey, I'm looking to sort of change the system a bit. And culturally, I think Gary Johnson can also make a pretty solid play for Democrats. He'll tell you that in the I Side With online quiz that sort of tells you what political affiliation, his line is that, outside of himself, he sides with Bernie Sanders 73% of the time on issues. So I think there's an interesting idea here that he might draw equally from both Republicans and Democrats who are disaffected this year.
Yeah, Jennifer, in some ways I could see the Democratic argument almost better, imagining somebody who, particularly maybe a slightly younger voter who's not interested in criminal penalties for a lot of currently illegal drugs, who's essentially pro-choice, doesn't want intervention on abortion, and is also maybe a little freaked out by Hillary Clinton's overall international interventionist vibe. That there maybe just kind of, I'm even thinking of my son who's 26, who keeps saying, well, if anybody in the current field would ever get us into a war, it's her. So you could sort of see maybe why Democrats of a certain ilk who are unhappy with their current choice could go over there.
I do agree with that, and I think the type of Democrat who won't go over is actually a pretty strong Hillary Clinton voter. In other words, perhaps a little bit older voter, someone who has a union background, someone who thinks that the safety net is not strong enough, who wants to build upon some of the government programs. Those types of people are going to have a hard time swallowing Johnson, because what he talks about most, other than drug legalization, which is a big issue for him, is how he's going to shrink and make the federal government disappear. And so for a lot of Hillary voters, those are fighting words. But I do think the cultural vibe, as you say, is very important. I also think that although these two folks have the most governing experience of anybody running for president, neither one of them seem to be an insider. Part of that is the libertarian kind of pose, that they're really anti-government in some sense. Part of it is that they've never served in Washington. They've been governors out in the hinterland. Part of it is that for a lot of voters, they're new people. For me, they seem like they've been around forever, but that's because I remember when they were both governors. Many voters who have come along since then, this may be the first time they're being introduced to these people. So I do think they have the capacity to draw both from small government Republicans and kind of the cultural Bernie Sanders folk. He is in favor, or I'll put it this way, he's against government prohibiting gay marriage. That's the sort of formulation. They don't want to tell us they are in favor of gay marriage, but they're opposed to government regulating that. There's also a lot of other issues of internet freedom, NSA surveillance, a lot of these issues that resonated particularly with young, slightly more affluent Bernie Sanders voters. I could see a lot of college kids going over to the Libertarian ticket.
Of course, first they have to find out anything. And so we have a little clip here. So for those of you who, unlike Jennifer, don't remember Gary Johnson, here he is quite recently talking to Tess Stewart from Rolling Stone.
I would not be doing this if there weren't the opportunity to win. But the only opportunity that I have of winning is to be in the presidential debates. And to be in the presidential debates, I've got to be in the polls. Right now, I've been in 3 national polls, but in the meantime, there have been another 40 polls where my name has not been included.
Okay, this is actually a clip with Chuck Todd. Wrong identification. But anyway, so this is a little bit of a problem, Claire, in the sense that libertarianism isn't a unified brand. It's sort of weird because it's the only one of the political parties that still talks about itself in terms of theory a lot of the time, libertarian theory. Nobody talks about democratic theory or Republican theory. So in a sense, you'd think, well, it must be a very unified brand, but it's not. You know, in a lot of people's minds, it's associated with crackpots like Lyndon LaRouche. In other people's minds, it's associated with a guy like maybe Ron Paul, who cuts a much more conservative profile than does Gary Johnson or Bill Weld. So one of the things that Johnson desperately needs is exposure to establish how much he resembles any of the foregoing and how much he differs from it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Libertarianism is a very big tent, and it is. I was at their convention actually in Orlando, Florida last weekend, and you can really see how it runs the gamut. There are people who are in what they call the radical caucus, who are, they don't quite like to call themselves anarchists, but they sort of have a lot of those views, which is that, they don't believe in the validity of driver's licenses. They don't believe that the government should tell you whether or not, your 10-year-olds can do heroin. I mean, it's so, and these are things that, and they'll tell you, of course, 10-year-olds shouldn't do heroin, but from a theoretical point of view, this is a thing that it's, they're almost like the philosopher king party. They're a little bit suspicious of people in politics who are sort of in the dirty business of thing, and there's a lot of sort of theoretical questions that they like to bat around. The presidential debate at the convention involved, sort of hypothetical questions of should the U.S. have gotten into World War I and World War II, things like that. And then on the other side of things, you had a guy running for president, Austin Peterson, who for a couple weeks in there became a little bit of the darling of the talk radio right. Mary Matlin endorsed him, and that's partially because he'd come out with a libertarian pro-life stance. So that's sort of an example of how wide the tent of the party is. And I think Gary Johnson's job in the next month, I would say, is to sort of get on TV and talk as practically as he can to the American people about how libertarian ideas might translate in 2016. Obviously, Johnson is a practical guy, right? He's in favor of driver's licenses. He's not going to entirely upend the system and sort of give off the vibes that a lot of the people with a certain kind of radical reputation in his party give off. But he is saying a lot of the lines that I think Ron Paul had a huge effect on the Republican Party. I mean, how many times did people like Ted Cruz say in the primaries, we're going to end the IRS, things like that. And those are actually sort of libertarian, that sort of trickled down libertarianism in a way that's sort of made its way into Republican rhetoric. And so in some ways, Johnson, the ground has sort of been laid for Johnson. And so if he can speak to conservatives and say, do you really want radical small government? Well, here's my plan. And, he had quite a reputation for vetoing what he thought were fiscally loose policies in New Mexico. So I think he'll make an interesting case over the next month. But he also has some fundraising hurdles to overcome. I think that's going to be a big thing.
So Jennifer, obviously there is this kind of circular reasoning problem here that you need to do hit a certain level in the polls in order to qualify for the debates. But the polls aren't polling on you because you haven't been in a debate before or whatever. Anyway, it's very difficult to raise your profile up above the horizon. At least using that mechanism. Are there other mechanisms? I mean, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, they're not going to get on Rush Limbaugh's show. So how do they get their message to people who might be receptive to it?
Well, I'm not sure about Rush Limbaugh, but, for example, they've been on the Michael Medved show. He's a conservative talk radio host. So I wouldn't underestimate their ability to get on mass media. They are doing some Sunday shows, for example. When I interviewed Gary Johnson a couple weeks back, I was somewhat surprised because he doesn't come across as a doctrinaire libertarian. He says, for example, and this is controversial in the Libertarian Party, that he's in favor of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Many libertarians are not. They, of course, don't believe in discrimination, but they don't think the government should be prohibiting it. As we were talking about a moment ago, he believes in driver's license. When you ask him what he would like to do, he often gives a very sensible response, which is, I just get to sign, if I am president, what Congress sends me. And I promise you, anything that reduces the size of government, I will sign. And that is really a very practical approach that I think may work with a lot of voters, because they don't want to hear he's going to defund Social Security, he's going to remove the State Department. They don't want to hear sort of pie-in-the-sky, very sort of scary things. But here's a guy saying, I have an overall philosophy. Congress sends me the legislation, and this is the kind of stuff I'm going to sign. This is the kind of stuff I'm going to veto. And you're right. In terms of his veto record, he jokes. He says he's not quite sure of the statistic, but he claims to have vetoed more spending bills, than every other governor in office at the time combined. And that is true. He got quite a reputation for being a fierce vetoer.
So, Claire, now we're coming up to the problem that has dogged 538 throughout this election, which is, to what degree is history instructive, and to what degree is this election sui generis? And both things have to be kind of weighed here. But, we can talk, and I know you have written about some preceding candidacies that were important. I mean, Wallace with 14%, Ross Perot the first time with 19%. I mean, pretty obviously a factor in that election, whatever anybody thinks Nader might have done in 2000. I think, one of the differences here, at least anecdotally, is, when you talked to people in some of those election cycles and you said, well, this might have your vote might have the unintended consequence of electing the member of the nominee from the party that you're the least sympathetic to. I just don't hear those conversations right now. Now you say, if you vote for somebody from a libertarian or a third-party candidate, it might really wreck your own party's candidate's chances. They say, I know, that's why I might do it.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a wise enough fool to say that 2016 is probably, as you said, sui generis. That we don't quite know what's going to happen. Just to give people sort of a historical anchoring. Yes, Ross Perot took 19% of the vote share in '92. about this time in May of '92, he was polling at 17%. So not too far off where he ended up. That said, we don't really know how all of this is going to play out, and how Gary Johnson is going to play in the media. I think he's in some ways he could be a very sort of attractive presence, because he's sort of guileless and a little aw shucks, and sort of comes off as authentic. And again, I mentioned earlier, Trump and Clinton are sort of historically disliked people. On the other hand, maybe Clinton and Trump get worried about him and sort of use the libertarian, I mean, this isn't politic to say, but sort of the wacko label that it can have. And so I think I will say, I will exercise a little caution here and say that it's unclear that Gary Johnson will be polling at 10% in 2 months. His poll numbers could slip precipitously, and I think we really just don't know what's going to happen. But I think we'll start to have, I do think it's part of the process of, Johnson should probably be included in a lot more polls, and I don't think we have enough data yet to know sort of, to sort of stake out a pattern and say, here are the kind of people who might lean towards him. Yeah, I really just think we're working a bit at an information deficit at this point.
And Jennifer, is there anybody left, any prominent Republican who could help out? I mean, you look at the positions of these guys, and you look at the positions of Paul Ryan, and then you look at the positions of Donald Trump. And even though these guys, I mean Johnson and Weld, have some ideas that Paul Ryan would find pretty hard to swallow, I know Paul Ryan has staked a lot of his life on a kind of entitlement reform that Trump is just adamantly not going to do. And so many of the things that seem very important to Paul Ryan seem not anywhere on Donald Trump's radar, and maybe a little bit more on Gary Johnson's radar. But Ryan is gritting his teeth and standing next to Trump. Is there anybody left in the party, a prominent conservative, who could help these guys out by legitimizing them?
It's a very interesting question, because today Jeff Flake, who is a rather libertarian Republican from Arizona, announced that he cannot support Donald Trump. And I do wonder what would happen if he, for example, lent his credibility to these guys. There are other Republicans who are really very small government folk who you could imagine, although many of them have signed up behind Donald Trump. Just two quick things. One is, I think it's going to be hard for Donald Trump to play the wacko card with libertarians, because he himself has a problem with extreme, weird positions. So maybe Hillary Clinton, who I think is going to try to play the grown-up in this race, is going to use that. I don't recommend that approach to Donald Trump. The second thing is that they are already on 32 state ballots, and they're rather confident they're going to wind up on all 50. They will be the only third party, significant one aside from perhaps the Green Party, that will be on that many ballots. And for that reason alone, I do think it's incumbent upon the pollsters to measure them, if for no other reason to see how much is being bled off two of the main candidates. So I think the historic unpopularity of these two candidates, I think social media will help them. I do think their demeanor is a respite from the bombast that you hear from Trump and kind of the politically over-scripted kind of rhetoric you hear from Hillary Clinton. So they could very well do well. Gary Johnson is right, though. It's all about getting to 15% so he can get on that debate stage. If he doesn't, I would see him receding back to single digits. If he does, I could see him doing as well, if not better, than Ross Perot.
Jennifer, let me ask you one more question, which is that in previous cycles, David Koch has even run for vice president as a Libertarian Party candidate. Do we know where those guys are? Do we know where the Koch brothers are in all this? Because there's prominent Republicans and then there's money, and money is not unimportant. I was asking you, Jennifer. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. We don't know. There has been all sorts of reports and then denials that they are either going to be backing Libertarian or they're going to be backing the Conservative. I suspect what they're going to do is not play in the presidential race very much and look to down ticket races and to state issues. So if I think Gary Johnson starts doing well and he could attract that kind of money, that's a whole new ballgame. And obviously, one of the difficulties they have in gaining name recognition is not only getting some free media, but also getting some earned media. And that does take some money, and get out the vote operations require money as well. So that would be a real coup if they could land some of the Koch money.
All right. This has been so great to talk to both of you. Claire Malone, a senior political writer for 538. I'll be listening to the podcast. It's now become one of my favorites. Jennifer Rubin, author of Right Turn, a blog for the Washington Post. Thanks for both of you being here. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to switch gears a little bit, talk about Muhammad Ali, and very specifically how Muhammad Ali became arguably the most important athlete of all time.
Yeah, he's a libertarian, self-reliant, but he's there when you need him, so don't tread on the libertarian.
Well, I suppose it's a fair question after a weekend of commemorations and lamentations. Are there things left to say about Muhammad Ali? But the other part of that is that he loomed so incredibly large. His impact on so many aspects of American life was so huge that, in fact, we could talk for weeks and weeks about him and not exhaust him as a topic. Joining us now is Dave Zirin, sports editor of The Nation. He's been on the show many times before. Writes a weekly sports column at Edge of Sports and hosts the weekly show Edge of Sports Radio. He's the author of many books, but most recently, Brazil's Dance with the Devil, the World Cup, the Olympics, and the fight for democracy, which I assume you're just kind of doing revisions of all the time. And I mean, that one is.
We just put out a new edition for the Olympics, and we were doing rewrites up to the last moment, and we end it really with Dilma on the verge of impeachment, which is not great given that she has been impeached, but at the same time, I think we got the contours right. A ton of corruption, a very precarious situation, and a lot of uncertainty going forward.
Right. Has not hit its angle of repose yet, I don't think. It's still a rock slide. But let's talk about Muhammad Ali. You know, the bridge, I guess, from the previous segment was one of our two guests to talk about libertarians said, well, Gary Johnson, unlike a lot of libertarians, he does support the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Some libertarians don't even support that. And when you say that, it's a reminder of what Muhammad Ali was doing in 1966. That, you know, I mean, people who've watched recently the Bryan Cranston thing about LBJ getting and the work to get that right, that act passed with this incredibly delicate, patched together, filibuster-plagued compromise. You realize just how edgy the American public was in the mid-'60s about the role of all African Americans. And here's this guy making this pronouncement about how he feels about American involvement in Vietnam and what he's going to do about it, Dave. So, I mean, you know, the cliche in sports interviewing is, how big was that? Well, that was big. That was really big when he did that.
I mean, all we really have to do is imagine what the reaction would be if an athlete did anything even similar to the absolute fiery necessity that Muhammad Ali brought to the table. I mean, telling truths that people just did not want to hear. I think if an athlete said some of these things today, they would be excoriated. And I also think many of the sports journalists who are issuing these fulsome tributes to Muhammad Ali would have no patience if an athlete today spoke out against U.S. war overseas, spoke out in favor of army resistance, said something like, "God damn the white man's money." That's an exact quote from Muhammad Ali. I mean, imagine anybody saying that, but more importantly, imagine how they would be received. Imagine if they would even be able to have a career after saying some of these things. And so this is who Muhammad Ali was. I mean, he was somebody who was a teller of very difficult truths, who risked an incredibly lucrative career to do so, was robbed of 3.5 years of his absolute prime to practice that career, and yet he is still perceived as having won. And I think that's why he's such a global icon to this day, is he took on the U.S. government and he won. And there's not a lot of people who can say that. And I'll tell you that I think it's such a tribute to the fact that he won. If you look at who's speaking at his funeral, President Bill Clinton. I mean, what that says above all else is that, there's this generation of politicians who have just said, well, we couldn't beat Muhammad Ali, so I guess we'd better join him.
Dave, did he win? He, as you said, lost 3.5 years of his prime fighting career. He didn't go to prison. The Supreme Court didn't so much vindicate him as cite what amounted to almost paperwork as a technical reason for vacating the charges against him. So did he win?
He won the way the fish won in The Old Man and the Sea. The old man wasn't able to land him, but the fish had been eaten within an inch of its life by the far lesser fish as he went through the waters. I mean, the greatest argument for actually questioning whether Ali won was just the fact that he was robbed of his voice. He came back into the ring. He found out that he had an unbelievable ability to take a punch. And by the time it was all done, he really had Parkinson's disease, which was aggravated by these repeated blows to the head or accelerated by these repeated blows to the head. And yet, despite all of that, of course he won. I mean, he went from being bugged by Richard Nixon to being invited to Gerald Ford's White House. He went from being renounced by the city council of Louisville to having the main thoroughfare in Louisville named after him. I mean, this is somebody who won because he never surrendered his principles. Instead, the country moved to him. The U.S. government moved closer to him. Now, in recent years, that's been much more complex as he's lost the ability to really speak for himself and as the United States has engaged in this endless war in the Middle East. But one could imagine what Muhammad Ali would have said if he'd had his speech during these last 20 years. And I think if he'd said what was on his mind, maybe there would be less celebrations of him upon his passing.
I think the other thing that might be difficult for a person who was not alive at the time to understand was how big a celebrity Muhammad Ali was at that moment. He was, first of all, boxers were famous then in a way that they really aren't today. I mean, the average American with a very average interest in sports in 1965 could have rattled off the name of minimum 8 to 10 boxers. People knew who they were. It was on television a lot, and there wasn't that much else on television. And it was just a less maligned and more exciting sport. And then But piled on top of that was his superstardom. There really nobody had ever seen anything like him. My mother, who was a Goldwater Republican, was absolutely in love with Cassius Clay. I mean, she just worshipped this guy. His looks, his charisma. He actually not only was dominating the field of boxing, but he was kind of revamping the idea of what a boxer looked like and spoke like. I mean, it's very difficult even to describe now what the impact of that celebrity was.
Yeah, I think one of the best descriptions of it that I read is that being the heavyweight champion in Ali's day was like being the heavyweight champion of masculinity. I mean, you were the toughest guy in the toughest sport. And so to have the heavyweight champion not only tell everybody how pretty he was, but also be somebody who would not support war. Mm-hmm. I mean, this was something that really turned people on their heads. I mean, think about being a 50-year-old white fight fan, and having your heavyweight champion to talk about how pretty he was and say that he had no quarrel with them Viet Cong. I mean, it really did. It took the whole lexicon of American sports heroism and turned it on its head.
On the other hand, as you were suggesting earlier, in a way he changed everything, and in another way, nothing changed. So, yeah, I think even reading his quotes now about being a Muslim and therefore being guided more by Muslim precept and Muslim law than by anything else, and for that reason not being able to go and fight a war in Vietnam, in which he felt he had, as a black man, no real stake anyway. You're right. If an African-American athlete right now who is also a Muslim said stuff like that, he might be torn apart. He or she might be torn apart. I mean, if Serena Williams suddenly said something like that, I'm not even sure what would happen.
Well, and also even more so, if the fact that they were Muslim was something that they applied and said, like, as a Muslim, I disagree with what the United States is doing in the Middle East. I disagree with drone attacks. I disagree with the idea that innocent Muslims are being killed from the skies by my country. I mean, imagine how that would be received. Again, I can't say this loudly enough. So many of the journalists who are praising Muhammad Ali would bury a contemporary athlete for taking 1/5 of the stands that he took. And to know that, you just have to look at like the athletes who stood with Black Lives Matter the year before last and how they were treated by the press. I mean, it was treated as if it was just like this unbelievably either horrible or at the very least sensationalized thing, instead of just saying, wait a minute, they're citizens in this country. They're upset with what's taking place. They have a platform. Why shouldn't they be able to speak? Which is exactly what people were saying about Muhammad Ali many decades ago. So I really don't know how much progress we've made, but I do know that the very existence of Muhammad Ali and the example that he continues to provide means that there's some of that wine that just cannot be put back in the bottle.
You know, the other thing that intrigues me. Well, actually, I want to go back to that moment in '66, and also ask another thing about it. I've often wondered if one of the downsides of that moment was the way that Ali became magnetized about this issue and became symbolic of a black man refusing to fight in Vietnam. I mean, in retrospect, we now know that black Americans fought in Vietnam at a slightly, not much, but a slightly higher percentage than their actual population, that their casualties were marginally even higher than their proportion of the actual U.S. population. And in a way, you had this very convenient symbol for a lot of people who might have wanted to go negative, particularly after the battles of the mid-'60s, and say, well, look, here's this privileged black man. He won't even go fight in Vietnam, and to suggest that he was somehow or other emblematic of other people.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I have no idea what to even add to that, except that his heroism cut across generational lines as well. And it's interesting looking back, like how many young people loved this guy when the entire world hated him. And that's why I've been saying this on other shows. I think it's so important. I think we all understand that Muhammad Ali was shaped by the 1960s, that if you don't have this period of upheaval, you don't get this person. But Muhammad Ali also shaped the 60s. And this idea of what he said, I don't have to be what you want me to be. I mean, that's what a whole generation was saying. And you had the establishment just lining up against him, and yet you had kids lining up to see him speak. Now, where did you ever have that in U.S. society except for, I guess, rock and roll? Mm-hmm. And rock and roll, Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, I mean, it was anything but explicitly political. So this was different, and this was special. And it's one of those things, again, that you can't erase what he meant to so many people, although it is kind of stunning to see people try in real time to blunt his more ragged edges.
Well, Dave Zirin, I know you've got a full dance card today. We promised you'd be out by 1:45. We're going to deliver on that promise. Your new book, we'll have to have you back for this, Brazil's Dance with the Devil, the World Cup,
I'd love to.
The Olympics, and the fight for democracy. Thanks for being with us today.
No, thank you.
And we'll be back after this.
Dream me a dream of my own. I will walk alone by the black muddy river. Sing me a song of my own.
Stay with us. Colin will be right back with a tribute to a man who survived 3 concentration camps to become one of Hartford's most famous business leaders. Today's show was produced by Betsy Kaplan and me, Kyone Wolf. Our interns are Esther Shitu and Olivia Piper. Greg Hill appeared in the intro and tweets for us at WNPR Colin. The part of Bill Curry was played by Ron Paul. For show pages, articles, and photos of the Here and Now staff reading The Fountainhead, go to our website, wnpr.org/Colin. On tomorrow's show, the story of Jehovah's Witnesses. And now, back to Colin.
So actually, there's an odd intersection between that show and the segment that we're about to do, because the Jehovah's Witnesses were defiers of the Nazi regime, and they went to concentration camps, and they were even occasionally, they were often, I think, offered the chance to get out by renouncing who they said they were, and they wouldn't do it. So there is kind of an odd tie-in to the segment we're going to do right here. And So how to begin? Well, actually, I said something on social media over the weekend that you couldn't write the history of Hartford in the 20th century without mentioning David Chase. I mean, he was that intrinsic to what Hartford was, both in terms of his role as a businessman and a creator of buildings that still shape and define the skyline of this city. I was lucky enough to work in one of them, the Gold Building, for quite a long time, but also as a philanthropist, also as a civic leader, also as somebody who believed in the city where he lived and the idea that it could get better. And so we lost him at the age of 88. His services were yesterday, and now joining us, his son, Arnold Chase, also a philanthropist and president of Chase Enterprises. Arnold, first of all, my condolences at a very difficult time for you, and thank you at this time for making room for this appearance.
Thank you, Colin.
So I want to begin just by reminding people what this man had to overcome to become who he was. Your sister Cheryl, I think in the paper, called him a fighter and a survivor. Can we begin there? I mean, this is an incredible story that this man survived 3 different death camps, escaped from the third one, and made it to this country. Is there anything more you can tell us about that story? I don't know how much he would have talked to you about it.
You know, he talked very, very little about it to my sister and myself. And most of what we know, we read in stories and interviews with strangers. Mm-hmm. And over the years, we've been able to piece together a lot. But as is typical with many Holocaust survivors, they really don't want to talk about it.
Once he got here, he then became, he lived that kind of basic American success story, starting with essentially nothing, having had to even, I think, lie about his age to get to America, and then just beginning to build up from nothing. And I think it's a hard thing for somebody who hasn't done that to imagine what kind of temperament it takes, to do first this thing, then that thing, an assortment of what really kind of amounted to odd jobs that he turned into businesses. And did he tell you anything about that was a kind of a transferable life lesson?
We had a lot of life lessons from him, and probably the most central life lesson to our relationship with our father was that of sense of family and love. And as humans, we don't innately possess awareness of when a loved one will pass, and far too often, despite our best intentions, the opportunity to express meaningful last words is lost forever. And no one really understood this better than my father, who lost virtually his entire family in almost an instant at the death camps. And what troubled him for the rest of his life was his inability to know when his family passed, and his inability to express final words to them. And as such, he never wanted any of his newly created family to endure the guilt and pain that he went through. So the first life lesson he taught us was the importance of basically the words, "I love you." And, he by deeds and by words, he made us realize that none of us know when our last day will be. And I know growing up, I've heard so many people say that have lost a loved one say, well, I think I knew this person loved me, or I wished I had said this or that. And what he taught us was every time we see one another, there's a hug, a kiss, and an "I love you" at the beginning and the end. And that way, if something unexpected happens, you always have said what you wanted to say. And in our case, with our father's sudden and unexpected passing a few days ago, the fact that our last words to him were indeed "I love you" has really brought us much comfort and closure. And the next most important lesson my father taught us was never to lose hope, despite however bad things seemed to be at the time. And, in the camps there were numerous cases of fathers having witnessed the loss of their entire families, and Hitler, by all accounts, was on a path to world domination. And many of these people would literally give up on life by surrendering their will to live. They would just roll over and die, even though physically they could have gone on. And, for our father as well, there was absolutely nothing hopeful anywhere in his future that would have encouraged him to live. Yet despite all of that, he did everything possible to survive. And I often say, even if an angel had spoken to him at that moment, telling him that in the future he would be friends with numerous United States presidents, he would travel on Air Force One, or be literally embraced at the Belvedere, which is the Polish White House, by the president of Poland, or be called my Jewish brother by the Pope, or he would enjoy success beyond his wildest imagination, there would be absolutely no reason to believe any of it. And you think, and we think, how different things would have been if he too had just given up. So, the lesson to us, and the lesson really for all of us, is that just because you absolutely can't see any light at the end of the tunnel, no matter how hard you work, doesn't mean it's not there. He taught us every tunnel is not straight, and even the brightest light at the tunnel's end can't be seen if you're dealing with a curved tunnel. But it's nevertheless there, and if you keep looking for that light, you will find it. So the never give up message was so important to him, and probably the third most important life lesson to us was that his business successes were merely a means to an end, to create the resources that allowed him to fund numerous good deeds and actions. And he taught us by example the importance of charity, and to him it mattered little whether he was helping Buddhists build their first house of worship in this area, or helping Catholic charities, or supporting Jewish causes. And while people are aware of his public generosity, the reality is that it was matched or exceeded by decades of his privately helping people. And some of those stories are just amazing. And really to summarize what he stood for, it's the ability to transcend hate and have tolerance and forgiveness. And as you can imagine, his life was one of contrasting extremes. He experienced the greatest cruelty and inhumanity that ever existed, yet he managed to achieve a life full of utter fulfillment and love. And he took nothing for granted and lived every day to the fullest. So, those are the things we cling to, even though he's gone now.
Oh, we got just a tweet right now, Arnold. And by the way, Arnold's an old radio guy, and he's managed to kind of bring us in for a landing right at the appropriate time when the show's ending. Somebody tweeted, "My mom loved him. She explained his whole history to me and taught me that when I met a Muslim, I should say assalamu alaikum." So, Arnold Chase, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll just quickly add my own 2 cents, which is that, in an era where so many people, particularly people of means, are saying, what can such and such a place do for me? What can you do for me so I'll stay here? David Chase always seemed to be saying to Hartford, what can I do for you? What can I do next for you? And for that, we owe a tremendous debt. But Arnold, our condolences from all of us here at WNPR. Obviously, you're a great friend of the station, too. And to you and your family, our great sorrow. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Colin.
All right, we are going to go out with that. Thanks very much to Betsy Kaplan for producing today's show. We're going to be back tomorrow with a show about Jehovah's Witnesses on Wednesday. We will do our annual Song of the Summer show, which always seems to make everybody mad, including us, but we do it anyway. Thanks for listening today.